Hello, everyone, and welcome to Context. This program is brought to you by the Idaho Humanities Council with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The views expressed here today do not necessarily represent those of the IHC or the NEH. My name is Johanna Bringhurst, and joining us today is Jim Gentry. Dr. Gentry taught history at the College of Southern Idaho between 1969 and 2010. He completed his Ph.D. in history at the University of Utah in 1985. While completing his dissertation, he became inspired to research and write local history. Since 2003, he has completed 4 local histories. In the middle and on the edge, the Twin Falls region of Idaho in 2003, Meeting Needs and Developing Opportunities, a history of the College of Southern Idaho in 2015, Transformations, a history of First Baptist Church of Twin Falls, Idaho in 2020, and most recently, the 51 tunnels that saved Twin Falls Canal Company's bold solution to a big drainage surprise. These studies demonstrate the resilience of communities during booming or stressful times. Jim, thank you for joining us today. It's so good to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me.
You wrote this last book with Brian Olmsted about 51 little-known tunnels under Twin Falls. Can we start by talking about the creation of Twin Falls as a city? The Twin Falls area was a desert that was irrigated by the Milner Dam when it was built in 1905, which brought settlers to the area. Is that right?
Yes, in fact, in the building of Twin Falls was really done to attract people to come in for irrigation. The Twin Falls Land and Water Company had been created in 1900 to encourage irrigation. They wanted to sell irrigated farmland, but they discovered that the people didn't want to buy any land until they saw that it was going to work. So the decision in 1904 to construct a city, in essence, before the dam was closed, was to show settlers that there was confidence in the future and that the developers were putting their money where their mouth was, so to speak. And that just made all the difference in the world. They had tried earlier and had not been successful in selling very much land.
So when settlers came to the area and started farming, within just a few years, a very unexpected problem arose for a desert. What happened?
Yeah, something that no one had anticipated. In fact, the Twin Falls Canal Company gained occupation of the irrigated land, and things were going well. Starting in 1909, the Twin Falls Canal Company took over from the Twin Falls Land and Water Company. And starting in 1909, well, 2 years later, in 1911, there began to be a small amount of seepage. And that is that water was coming up out of the land, really kind of like artesian, if you think about artesian water. And it was coming up, and of course, you can't cultivate wet land. And so after about 135,000 acres had been developed, there was the problem with 500 of those acres. By 1913, 500 acres were so seeped that they could not be cultivated. So the company had a new problem on its hands and worked long and hard to solve it.
So what was actually going on? Why were the fields flooding with the seepage?
Well, what had happened is when you think about Twin Falls, it was a very dry area, a very, very little amount of water. And so therefore, the water table was very, very low when the settlers first came in. In fact, the first documented well was not done until 1908. there was just no water there. But all of a sudden with irrigation, you're dumping enormous amounts of water into the farmland, and it has to go somewhere. The assumption was that the water would go down into the soil and then would go out in springs, such as occurs on the north side of the Snake River Canyon. So things like Thousand Springs and Blue Lakes, and there's a lot. Niagara Springs. There were several examples, but the soil and the lava rock on the south side would not allow the water to come through. And so you have an issue of where the water is going in, and there's no place for it to go other than accumulate. I think you can use the example of pouring water into a bowl, or maybe you could think of a bathroom sink. If you've got the stopper open, then the water can go on through. If you close it off, then you're going to have a flooded bathroom floor. So they really, the prediction of how this would work simply had not been calculated adequately.
The Twin Falls Canal Company was responsible for irrigation in the area, and they were turned to by farmers in the community to solve the drainage problem. How did they try to fix the issue?
Well, of course the issue again was how to get rid of the water and who was responsible and so forth. But what they discovered fairly quickly is that if they would drill wells, the water would come gushing up out of the soil, and then of course the problem is what happens to the water. And if you and I had a big puddle of water that we were trying to get rid of, we'd make a little ditch. But the problem here was that the ditches did not have slant. They didn't have any angle to them. So they would get the water up from the wells, but the water would just sit there. And so what they had to figure out was how to get the water moving. So another thing they did with the wells was they would dig ditches, including big ditches, and try to divert the water through the ditches. But again, the problem was that it did not want to drain because of the lack of an angle. So the ultimate trick with the tunnels was to get an angle so the water would go down instead of remain flat, or if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Yeah, so from around 1911 through the 1920s, the company tried these different techniques. Who was it who came up with the idea of trying to put tunnels under the land to allow for drainage?
Well, and like so many historical things that began, the people at the time don't realize what a unique development, and so it's not documented as well as we might like. But there had been a lot of interest, and it had been observed that the water was seeping not very far from the Snake River Canyon. If you could just get the water, in some cases a matter of 200 or 300 feet closer to the canyon, then it would fall there. So there was experimentation. But the fellow who we'd have to give credit was Burton Smith, and he was the general manager from 1924 to 28, and he took some risk because the directors of the Twin Falls Canal Company didn't think this was going to work. And so Smith says, in essence, I'm going to try it anyway. And so the first canal that began to be driven was in 1924. And there were some experiments a little bit before that, trying to figure out what might happen. But definitely and that's one of the best known of the tunnels, the fish hatchery tunnel, that would become very much a model.
How were the tunnels created? What was the process of driving a new tunnel?
Well, it was a very complicated process. I'm glad you've asked that question because I think that if we just look at it and you say, well, you just drive the tunnels. Well, one of the questions that had to be solved before you could do anything else was determine where's the tunnel going to go. And that was the engineers for the Twin Falls Canal Company. You had to work it all out. And believe it or not, these wells I'm telling you about, the wells had to be lined up with the tunnels because the water was going to come up out of the wells and would be going down through the tunnel. So the process of determining that, then once they had decided where the tunnel should go, and you can imagine there was a lot of discussion on that because the shareholders, the people who were members of the Twin Falls Canal Company, the farmers are called shareholders. They own shares in that. So you can imagine each one wanted to get the tunnel in the best position for them. But fundamentally, what happened was that the tunnels had to be driven, not dug. And the reason we need to use that understanding is that this was a mining process. It was not a matter of digging into dirt. And so they would find out where they wanted to put the tunnel. Then they would use massive compressors. And fortunately, by this time, by 1924, the internal combustion engine was very effective. But they would use compressors, go in, then they'd put in the dynamite and then blow it. And then they would have, each tunnel would have rails for a little ore car so that the material that had been, they exploded, the rocks which had been crushed, then had to be hauled out. And they said that 4 to 5 feet a day would have been oftentimes all they could make. It was a very, very slow process.
It sounds so time consuming and so draining, like a lot
Yes.
of hard labor.
And you have to figure out who's going to do this. And so they had to put out bids for contractors, and they would have multiple bids, as you can imagine. These bids then would, the canal company directors would select the contractor based upon the bids. And you can tell when you look through them as they had certain individuals who had done a lot of work for them, and there was a trust factor there. And so you see a lot of recurring names.
For the next few years, the Twin Falls Canal Company continued to contract for more tunnels to be built. Meanwhile, the Twin Falls area underwent significant growth and development. The Perrine Bridge, is that how you say it? Perrine?
Ryan?
Perrine Bridge was constructed. The American Falls Dam was finished, and the extension of the railroad. 1927 was a big year for that area. How else was Twin Falls changing during that time?
Well, part of the problem Twin Falls had was that right after World War I, there had been a major agricultural recession from 1920 to about 23. And what had happened is that during the war, there had been all this pressure to increase wheat production and everything. Then once the war ended in 1918, the Germans and the English and so forth, they wanted to cultivate their own wheat. And so there was a glut. So that complicated that period just before the tunnels, that period just before 1924 was a tough period in general. But starting around 1924, 1925, the economy begins to pick up significantly. And one of the things that occurs is that there had, as a result of the agricultural depression, they had learned the need to do crop rotations, use different crops. Beans became very important. Um, so the economy in general during the 20s had began to boom, and a lot of it was tied to new technology. We've all heard of the Roaring 20s. Well, part of the roar was interested in anything that was new and new technology. So new dancing, radios, automobiles, and then of course, when you have automobiles, you have to have tires and gasoline. And so all those things fit together. Also, during the 20s, the airplanes became important. And so airports had to be built. And so, in a sense, what happens is that a lot of the economy is booming because of this new technology. And of course, when we look at the Prime Bridge, that wouldn't have been built had it not been for the automobiles.
Of course. So the Twin Falls Canal Company, as you said, was buying equipment that had these latest advances in technology, and they had to take on a lot of debt to make those purchases to keep building tunnels. How did they continue to operate while building more tunnels into the 1930s?
Twin Falls Canal Company faced the same problems that sometimes we face, and that is often there's a desire for more goods and services than we have money to pay for. And that became a real controversial issue with the canal company. In fact, at least two of the general managers lost their jobs because of the issue of debt. And so,
Oh,
yes,
wow.
debt accumulated, and the question of how to create tunnels and how to finance them, there was a lot of money being put into the tunnels. But when we get to the Depression, for instance, there's only 3 tunnels that are done over a year. In other words, we can look and see the relationship between the economy and the building of the tunnels, as you could imagine.
So I'm wondering, how did the Great Depression impact the Twin Falls area?
Oh my gosh, yeah. One of the
Brutal.
things that's so interesting is when you look at the early 20s, well, the mid 20s, from about 25 to 29, the economy is doing relatively well in this area. And I know there were some places where that was not so true, but in this area, there's all kinds of evidence that the economy was really doing well. But we have to look at that through the eyes of someone who doesn't know so much, because it's easy. I used to tell my students, it's easy for us to sit around and think that the people in 1928 were just thinking about, oh gosh, the Depression's going to be coming next year. Well, they didn't know that then. And so the same thing is true here. And the building of the economy came to a screeching halt during the Depression. There simply was a lack of capital, and it impacted everything, the number of visitors to Yellowstone, to any number of factors. And so the price of commodities dropped dramatically. As a result of that, the farmers could not make payments on their farms. Foreclosures occurred. So up until from about 29, late 29, up to about 33, 34, things were really tough.
One of the interesting things about Idaho's history is that President Roosevelt's New Deal programs really had an impact in our state. Can you tell more about the New Deal programs that impacted the Twin Falls area?
Yes, you don't want to get me started too much.
Is this
But
a favorite
anyway,
subject, Jim?
there's kind of there's kind of two New Deals. There's one from 33 until 35, and then 35 things start changing very rapidly. But in the early days, after Roosevelt came into office, one of the big issues was trying to get jobs for individuals and also trying to stimulate the local economy. So one of the developments we see is the CCC program, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And one of the things that made those so valuable is that the foodstuffs for the people working in the Civil Conservation Corps were purchased from local merchants. So that really brought some money into the economy. And even though Twin Falls was not, the CCC were not working for the canal company, they were still impacting. But more specifically on the canal company, the Public Works Administration, which was very effective in the very early years, began to put a lot of people to work for the canal company. And they were involved in working with the canals. They had to be careful to not get them in too much danger. It's interesting to see how the employees of the canal company were involved in handling the dynamite and so forth. And so anyway, a major factor was the farm loans, the creation of the Southern Idaho Production Credit Association. And in the middle of 1934, the local paper talks about how the Twin Falls courthouse was full of farmers who were getting their farm loans recalculated. And that, of course, cut down on foreclosures significantly. And I find that a lot of memories that people have, older people, and of course, a lot of those older people are gone now, but they don't remember the good times between 36 and 39. They tend to remember all of it as just one big depression. But statistically, and in the middle and on the edge, I've included a lot of that kind of stuff. But statistically, the banks were getting major deposits from the farmers. One that I get a kick out of in 1936, Twin Falls County sold more automobiles than any other county in Idaho, and the paper bragged about they even beat Boise, even beat Ada County, So the newspaper did a wonderful job of tracking, what was going on. So
there was a housing boom in Twin Falls, but what happened when Pearl Harbor was attacked and the U.S. became involved in World War II?
I'd like, but one thing I didn't mention is very important. My book is Sun Valley in 1936. So I'd like to go back and insert that. Maybe I can just give and then you can go back to your question. How's that?
Yeah, tell us more about what was going on in Sun Valley, and then we'll catch up to World War II.
Yeah, one of the really important developments for the Twin Falls area was the opening of Sun Valley in 1936. And this brought in a lot of capital from Union Pacific. And there was a pride in this. There was the idea that if Union Pacific was going to spend that kind of money, then Twin Falls ought to have an up-to-date bus station. It should have good train transportation and movement of goods. And so a lot of this, including the demand to remove the toll from the Prime Bridge, that when the bridge was built in 1927, it had been a toll bridge. And the paper kept saying, if Union Pacific can spend that much on the skiing, then the least we can do is provide a free bridge. And so the tolls were removed in 1940. You know, it had a great impact on the economy, but it also was a reflection of the impact of Sun Valley on the economy. I think I garbled that a bit, but anyway.
No, that was great. Yeah, so then catch us up to World War II and how that impacted Twin Falls.
Okay, so between 36 and 39, the economy had begun to improve. But there had still been a general issue of a problem of too many employees, problems of unemployment. But as the horizons for World War II began to look worse and worse, that began to shift. Even before Pearl Harbor in 38, for example, the Idaho Twin Falls was involved in providing potatoes for the Lend-Lease program and so forth. But along comes Pearl Harbor, and all of a sudden, we're no longer looking at the war that's going on over there, but we're now looking at a war that is impacting directly. And this had enormous impact in terms of reshuffling population. People who had been farm workers, there was now advertisements in the Twin Falls paper for aluminum workers needed in Portland, Oregon, and so forth. So there was a massive movement of population around, but there was a shortage. There was a shortage of labor, which of course helped. If you were looking for a job, that was very helpful. This also, as a result of Pearl Harbor and the United States entering the war, we have the impact of the Minidoka relocation camp, and Japanese and Japanese Americans brought into this area, not because they wanted to, but because they were relocated. So lots going on there, but a lot of the economy that was for people who were living in Twin Falls, in other words, not the soldiers, but the home people had the same kind of good, quote unquote, economy that they had earlier. Because now in the depression, you're trying to figure out what are you going to do with pigs because you have excess pigs. Now every amount of food that could be produced was needed. And so I think that era, as a good term, is feeling needed, the farmers.
But still, the seepage issues persisted and tunnels were continually being constructed. Is that
Yes.
right?
The seepage problem, and we find this later on, I won't get into the details on it, but the seepage problem peaked around 1939. The water accumulation after 1939 was still there, but it was not coming at this just impossible rate. As a result of that, there continued to be tunnels that were driven up to 1951, but they were not driven as long. A lot of those tunnels were maybe 100, 200 feet. And compared to the longest tunnel, the Orchilera Tunnel, which was about 1.5 miles. So there's definitely a shift, and also part of the dilemma of the company is that the cost of driving these tunnels had increased significantly. With World War II, there was a need for more and more, money, shall we say, and as a result of that, the inflation. So it was costing, by the time of the last tunnel, it was costing about double what it did in 1928 for a foot of rock being removed.
Double the cost.
Pardon me?
Double the cost.
Yes, yeah. And
Did the
so,
tunnels, sorry, keep
yeah,
going.
well, I was just going to say in 1928, 29, I want to get too precise on my bet, about $7.50 per foot for, excavating the tunnels. By the last ones, by 1951, we're looking at $14 a foot. So you can imagine the canal company. And one of the things that complicated this period for the canal company is the need for security. We don't think about that too much, but the Twin Falls Canal Company hired security 24 hours a day because of the fear of sabotage or destruction of the, and that ended up being an issue that was big for the company. But they stopped that, I think it was in 1944. It was stopped before the end of the war. There was enough confidence that sabotage was not going to blow out the dams, apparently.
So did the tunnels last for a long time? Were they well made and well constructed?
Those tunnels are still there. And I went through some of the tunnels, and you can see engineer marks that were made, many, many years ago in the 20s or 30s. And this, we mentioned Brian Olmsted earlier. Brian was a great friend. And while I wrote the book, he helped me so much on some of the details. But one of the things that he pointed out is that these tunnels were made possible by the ravines and the canyons which exist in this area, like the Rock Creek Canyon, and there's a Mud Creek, and various tunnels are various various canyons. And without those canyons, the tunnels wouldn't have worked. There wouldn't have been any place to, because you see what the tunnel's doing is giving a larger slope so it can slope down into the canyon. But anyway, the tunnels have survived. And one of the things I didn't mention is very important was the importance of these tunnels for fish hatchery. That when the water came out of the first tunnel that was built in 1924, when the water came out, the water was about 58 degrees. And it just so happens that that was exactly the right temperature for raising fish. And so, and I have in the book, there's several pictures of showing these fish hatcheries as they exist today. There used to be more smaller ones in an earlier time. But yeah, the tunnels have stood the test of time. One of the issues of the 51 tunnels, most of them are on private property. And so you really, we're trying to look at some ways of opening up maybe 2 or 3 tunnels for examination, but they really are on private property. So you can't see them, but they're there.
The fish hatchery is such an unexpected benefit of the
Yes.
tunnels. Were there other unexpected ways that the tunnels benefited the area?
Yes, there were. A good example is when you think about the Twin Falls area. Rock Creek Canyon, of course, goes right through the middle of Twin Falls. And when you think of Rock Creek Canyon, it was very dry because there was water from the canals, the irrigation canals during the irrigation season, but the water's turned off in October or whenever that date is. And so what happens is all the greenery that you see, not only in Rock Creek, but in Mud Creek and some of these other areas, all that extra greenery is really a product of the tunnels. so that the trees, the area for birds, the habitat. And so that was something that was not anticipated in terms of a real advantage of those tunnels.
That's incredible. It's amazing to think that this once desert turned into a somewhat of a floodplain, and that the tunnels that were built so long ago are still there, still functioning, and that it's all hidden where you wouldn't know, you can't
Yeah.
see.
Well, I have told a number of people that the tunnels were so successful. That's why we don't know more about them, because when you're driving around in the land that's irrigated by the Twin Falls Canal Company, you don't see marsh area. And you don't see marsh area because the tunnels worked well. Now, part of that also is that the water table with the pumpers, the canal company isn't worrying too much about the water being too high these days. They're more concerned about it being low with the excess usage. But nevertheless, the tunnels worked very, very well. And they're like a lot of other things in life, is that the better they're working, the less observable they are. It's kind of like us doing our jobs on a day-to-day basis. If we're doing it well, and probably for the most part, there's not a big deal associated with it. It's just there.
I agree. I think there's something noble in that, right? Doing good work and not being
Yeah,
appreciated or noticed. So
yeah.
it's nice to give some love to these tunnels and the people who put so much time and work and effort into building them.
Yes, they did. And it was a real privilege for my part, because I started working on this about 3 years ago. Uh, Back in 2003, I had written this book, In the Middle and on the Edge, about Twin Falls. And there was one paragraph in my book on the tunnels that shows you how little I knew. And it wasn't a particularly good paragraph anyway, in terms of the Twin Falls Canal Company. But the canal company has been very generous in allowing me to go into their archives and use the director's minutes and the shareholder minutes and all of that kind of information. It's been really helpful to be able to write a book that's evidence-based rather than hoping for the best.
Dr. Gentry, it's been so wonderful to talk to you today. I really appreciate you being with us and helping us learn more about this really fascinating part of Idaho's history.
Well, I thank you for your interest in this topic, because it is not a topic that's very well known, but it illustrates what I used to tell my students, and that is every topic is interesting if you get into the details. But most of us don't know enough about things to really get into it.
Yeah, thank you for helping us get into the details.
Well, thanks for your interest.